I think people would benefit from understanding in figuring out what the costs are and so on. What does life look like? We have, as I mentioned, you just had a baby. We've got 3 kids. I'm trying to picture when my kids are 80, 90, what does this earth look like? What is it like for my grandkids, basically? What is it like for your grandkids? And I would like to understand that, Bjørn, because I will say, if we have an 8-foot rise in the Atlantic Ocean, America does look a lot different than it looks right now. The thought of Miami Beach more like a city of Atlantis, the thought of no more colorful falls, ski mountains going away, that kind of that brings it home. But do you believe that's likely?
So, Megyn, there's a lot of things to unpack here. First of all, the UN climate panel, which I think both David and I agree is the gold standard on this. They talk about 2 to 3 feet. They say very possible, but in a very outside range, it could be up to 6 feet of sea level rise. So it's certainly pushing at what David is talking about. And this often is the case that this is not actually what the best science from the UN climate panel tells us. But yes, 2 to 3 feet of sea level rise is a problem, and it is something that we should be concerned about. But we should also have a sense of proportion. Remember, over the last 150 years, sea levels rose about a foot. Yet I doubt anyone would ever, talk about what happened over the last 150 years, that was in any way important. We actually saw dramatically increasing areas, for instance, of the US and many other places, because, as you know, if you live in New York grew because you actually know how to do this. We know that very well from Holland, which is probably the best example. Holland is a wonderful place, which has about 40% of its land area below sea level. If you fly into the world's 14th largest airport in Amsterdam, you will fly into an airport that's much below sea level and is actually probably the only big international airport that is a former site of a big naval battle. The point is, we are actually really, really good species at dealing with these issues. And of course, Miami is not going to go away. We know how to protect this very cheaply. Remember, the entire cost of the Dutch protection over the last half century has cost about 10 billion euros. We estimate that globally, this is over 50 years. It's a very, very small cost. And of course, most rich countries and most upcoming countries will be easily able to afford that. Actually, what the models show is when you include adaptation is that we will be better situated. Right now, about 3.5 million people are flooded every year. And remember, this is a model estimate because it's really, really hard to get good estimates on this. But if you look out into the future, and David quotes that very specifically in his book, he says, if we do nothing, you will see 187 million people being flooded by the end of the century. That's absolutely true. And that would be a terrible catastrophe. It would also cost a huge amount of money. David mentions more than $100 trillion. But of course, we won't just sit around and do nothing. And the very same models that show us what happens if we do something, if we actually take action just like the Dutch have done, which we will have strong individual and state-wise incentive to do, we will reduce the number of people that will be flooded from about 3.5 million down to about 15,000 people per year, despite us being much richer, despite sea level being much higher, and despite there will be more people in the world. Why? Because resources and resilience is what really matters. And so there's a real risk that we end up focusing on the wrong thing. We focus on these very extreme and slightly exciting scenarios. You ask, what is the world going to look like for your kids and grandkids? Look back at how well we have done these scenarios in the past. In 1970, the first Earth Day, there was a lot of scenarios about how the world was going to look for the next 50 years. The UN told us, actually to the date, on January 25, 1972, told us the world had only 10 years left to live. In 1970, at the Earth Day, we were told that we would only be able to survive if we were wearing gas masks by 1985, because there would be so much pollution. Paul Ehrlich was talking about in 2000, the US would be decimated. We'd basically just be down to 26 million people starving in the US. Of course, nothing like that happened. We're a thriving nation, living much longer, being much better off, and nobody needs gas masks. So you have to be really careful about these alluring and intoxicating scenarios that tell you, oh, the world is all going to fail. No, there's a very, very good chance that we'll be much better off. And again, if I can just make this point, because I think we'll be coming back to this again and again. Even if you accept these incredibly high costs of 10%, Mark Carney, I mean, he's a climate campaigner, honestly. But, even if you accept the very high cost of 10%, the most of these sort of academically acceptable estimates show 3% of cost by the end of the century. But even if you accept 10%, the UN estimate that each person in the world will be 450% richer by the end of the century. So, yeah, we will then only be 400% richer. Yes, that's a problem. I certainly want to work with David and many others to make sure that we get closer to 450 rather than 400. But let's not fool ourselves. This is not a world that's going to be worse. Your kids, your grandkids, David's kids, his grandkids are going to be much better off living in a much better world. But yes, global warming will be a problem. Let's fix it smartly instead of making these policies that won't work.
Go ahead, David.
Oh, well, I think to some degree, the people living in the global north they'll certainly be protected. I think they'll be dealing with a world that's defined much more by climate impacts and climate disasters than the one today. But I hope that we can engineer some amount of adaptation to protect them and secure the sorts of promises that were extended to us into the future, that people can continue to live prosperous, flourishing lives. I'm much more concerned, and actually I think Bjørn's stated concerns line up with this, or with the lives of people living in the global south. And there I have much bigger worries. I don't think that we can blithely assume that the world will respond to dramatically intensifying weather and much more common droughts and flooding events and heat waves in the same way that we've done in Holland. And in fact, looking at the impacts in the US of extreme weather recently, I think even the American example is a much more complicated one than the Dutch one. Not to say that we haven't made some progress in making the country more resilient, but I think we've certainly failed to take the sort of dramatic total action that would protect people in the U.S. from the kinds of impacts that we're already seeing. And the Hurricane Ida, which killed people in New York City, it's not like we're living in a perfectly protected world. Now globally, fatalities from climate disasters, from weather disasters, have fallen over time. I expect that will probably continue, and that's a very good thing. At the same time, the impacts of such weather disasters in dollar totals are growing. They seem, roughly flat in terms of percentage of GDP, but in terms of total dollars, they're growing, and that's really concerning. And I'm in all of these contexts on all of these questions. Personally anchored from the perspective that we are really entering a new phase with climate change. That's not to say that, 1.4 degrees of warming is going to look like a completely different world than 1.2 or 1.6 than 1.4. These are differences that are, it's a spectrum, not a binary. On the other hand, I think it's really important to keep in mind, we are already today living on a planet that is warmer than it has ever been in the entire history of human civilization.